So what exactly do you think about the October 7th attack by Hamas on Israel?
Well, I mean, like what I just said, that it was horrible, and it's always, by the same logic that I'm giving you now, it's always evil to target innocent civilians. I don't believe civilians can be held responsible for the crimes of their government. This was, by the way, the Osama bin Laden logic, which I think would also be the logic of like Bill Clinton or George W. Bush or Barack Obama. But Osama bin Laden very explicitly said, when he was asked, like, well, are you just going to target like U.S. military sites, or are you targeting U.S. civilians? It was an interview in the 90s before 9/11. Um, and he goes, no, civilians are fair game too, because you guys have regular elections and you guys vote for your government, and therefore you're responsible for the crimes that they commit. Now, I think that's the logic of a fanatic like Osama bin Laden, and that's not the logic that any of us should follow. It doesn't make any sense, and it's not true that people are responsible for the crimes of their government. I think that that same argument is used quite a bit by people on the pro-Israeli side when they say, like, oh, they had an election in 2005 and Hamas won a plurality, therefore 20 years later they have no rights. I think that's insane. So Hamas had no right to go after civilians. It's horrible, and you see, these teenagers being killed, and the people, you see the images of people who were held hostage for all this time. So it's like your heart breaks for those people. It's truly tragic. I do think that it was in many ways an indictment of so many different things. Like October 7th happening was an indictment of the entire occupation / siege of Gaza and the West Bank, for that matter. It was, I think, should have probably forever destroyed the legacy of Benjamin Netanyahu, who is, I mean, this isn't like George W. Bush, you know, he was on the job for almost a year when 9/11 happened, but he was still kind of new, like it was still kind of in his first year of being president. Benjamin Netanyahu was the longest serving prime minister in Israeli history and had explicitly been like, I'm the tough right winger who's going to be tough on these Palestinians, who's going to like move away from the idea of coming to a two-state solution because this is what we need to keep us safe. Like the justification is like, I'm going to be hard on these motherfuckers because I know what it takes to keep us safe. And that culminates in the worst massacre in Israeli history. And then, I mean, the other big one is that, I mean, and it's not like I wouldn't even say an open secret at this point, it's just out in the open, that he had this strategy of propping up Hamas for years. And so he had this strategy of propping up Hamas for a myriad of reasons. But a major part of it was that, look, man, as long as there's terrorists in power there, there's never going to be any pressure on us to give the Palestinians a state because, look, are you telling me I got to negotiate with them?
He was allowing Qatar money to float.
Insisting that Qatar money float to them. When the Qatar money dried up, sent the Mossad in to insist that it gets back to him. Hundreds of millions of dollars, briefcases in cash. And he said in his own words that the reason for doing this was his words were prop up Hamas, bolster Hamas, to keep them in power so that the West Bank and the Gazans were divided, and that the international community, as well as the liberal Jewish community in Israel, wouldn't be able to put pressure on them to make a deal.
But what are the options? So if he doesn't allow the money in, it also looks really bad for him. Because if he's not allowing the money in, that means he's not allowing the quote-unquote aid in to help the Palestinians.
Yeah, but Lex, I mean, the dynamic here, right, is from 2007 to today, Israel's had a full blockade around the country. They won't let potatoes in, they won't let sugar in, they won't, and the justification is because they're dual use. They can be used to make rockets as well as they can be used to, feed starving children. So we can't let that in because it's dual use. but cash to Hamas? Does that not have dual usage? Like, is there nothing else that they can? So yeah, it's like, yes, when you have a full blockade around the country, you take on certain responsibilities. And I think this is, this is the essence of really the whole struggle here, which is very tough, I think, for the pro-Israel side to grapple with. But the bottom line is that Israel hasn't occupied Palestine for like a few months after a war, or even a couple of years after a war, while they're figuring out what we're going to do with them. It's been over 60 years. We're talking about a 1 week long war, or a day short of a week long war, in 1967. Israel's had control of them ever since. And much like in the same way that, like, if you kidnap someone and you lock them in your basement and you don't feed them, you murdered that person. So in other words, stated differently, you're not allowed to kidnap people and lock them in your basement. But once you do, you take on a responsibility to feed those people. You know what I mean? Like, you're not allowed to keep someone and not feed them. That is a worse charge than just keeping them. And so, yeah, anyway, I guess my point is, the solution to that, if you go like, well, I'm a bad guy if I fund Hamas, I'm a bad guy if I don't let the aid in, was to let the reputable international aid organizations bring aid in to the people of Gaza. Don't pressure the Qataris to send in briefcases full of cash. Allow internationally recognized, reputable human rights organizations who are lining up trying to do it. Stop turning them away and let them in. And this is just, it's so long past due. I mean, like, it's just, I'm not like defending Arab terrorism. I think it's really, it's a tragedy that the Arabs embraced terrorism. I don't think it's unique to them. And in fact, I think it was the Zionist militias who introduced terrorism to that part of the world. But there was also terrorism persists because it works. And this is true with state terrorism and with non-state terrorism. It's like terrorism has often worked for people. I think early Yasser Arafat, I know, was very influenced by the Algerians, who, successfully kicked the French out at embracing terrorism. And it was almost like the major miscalculation of those Palestinian Arabs who did embrace terrorism was that this isn't the French. This isn't the French hanging out in some colony with their home country back home, where maybe a few acts of violence could work enough to, the liberal population back home is like, oh, I really didn't like the response to that terrorism. We killed so many people. Forget it. This is too much of a headache. Let's get out of here. The Zionist settlers were there to stay. They weren't going anywhere. They weren't going back to Eastern Europe. You know what I mean? They were just that. And so it's a tragedy that this whole thing went the way it did. But you always, whenever you're talking about like a conflict like this, the person who has the party who has the power is the one who needs to make concessions, and it's just indefensible that the status quo of the Palestinian people having no rights, literally no rights, being ruled by a government that they do not get to vote for or against, no right to do commerce with the outside world, no freedom of travel, no freedom of movement, no basic property rights. You can be kicked out of your home at any time, no right to a fair trial, no right to a lawyer, no right to a jury of your peers. I mean, the fact that that has been the status quo since 1967 is just indefensible. And and then in the context that has been the status quo, I guess I'm just not, even though I'm against it, it's kind of like when you're just lecturing about the way in which they resist this, I think it's very tough to be on a strong moral footing,
Yeah, you have to really empathize with decades of suffering.
Yeah.
In the region. I suppose my question was grounded in how can the Israeli government, how can the world help the Palestinian people flourish? So you suggested allowing reputable aid organizations in, but that's kind of almost patching.
Yeah.
It's just helping humans who are suffering, but that's not how you have a nation flourish. You have to build up the infrastructure. You have to build up a culture of the education system, the democratic processes of electing and regular elections, and so that the people are represented, and you have to form partnerships, friendships, normalization of relations with the Arab world, with Israel. You can travel back and forth, and lessen the chokehold, like the security chokehold, that you could say is justified in a militaristic situation. But why is it a military situation? The question is, there, like, where do we go from here? If we, we'll talk about Netanyahu some more. He is he's very criticized inside Israel as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Maybe less so after October 7th, because again, in the same way you can empathize with the Palestinian people, you can empathize with Israelis, where October 7th touched, just like it did for Americans with 9/11, it touched some kind of primal thing
100%.
of fear, of like,
oh yeah, and like
holy shit.
The same thing I said before, like I could also very easily go, if one of my kids was like at that rave or something like that and just got gunned down or kidnapped I could understand being like, level the whole goddamn place, and I'm sure I would feel that way if that was one of my kids, so yeah, no, that's exactly right. I mean, there's lots of examples in the world of like France and Germany are right next to each other, and Ireland and England are right next to each other, and they're just totally living in harmony right now. Like, there is just the thought of them going to war is like inconceivable right now. Not saying it could never happen in the future, but it seems pretty hard to imagine. And that being the case would have been very hard to imagine for a very long time. Like there's some serious levels of brutality between those two societies, and even more directly involved. Egypt and Israel went to war 4 times in a couple decades. They went to war, and then in the late 70s they made a land for peace deal. And they haven't been to war since. And like, I do at least try to hold out that, like, that is, it's not like Egypt is, you're not going to say they don't have an issue with radical Islam in Egypt. You know what I mean? Like, that's not the answer. It's just that they made a land for peace deal. And once that wasn't that was solved, it was kind of easier to avoid the war. And I do like to think that there could be a solution to the Israel-Palestine question, but it's going to have to involve Israel taking their boot off of the Palestinians' neck. And I know that that's scary. And I understand that there are like legitimate concerns about that. There's was the great Thomas Jefferson quote about slavery, which was we have the wolf by the tail, and we can neither afford to hold on to him nor risk letting him go. Which is like, you could see where that would have been like a real concern of people, like right toward the end of slavery, or whatever, in the early 1800s, say the first half of the 19th century, where you'd be like, okay, we recognize this is wrong now, but we've had these millions of people enslaved for all these years. If we let them go, they're going to fucking kill us. And what are you saying? They're citizens now, meaning the Second Amendment applies to them, meaning that the guy who I enslaved now can get a gun? You know what? And so, okay, there are but I think in hindsight, looking back at it, we would all just go, yeah, but you can't enslave people. So like, whatever risks come with the next phase of this, unfortunately, like, you're going to have to just deal with that and move. You have to start with abolishing slavery.
And it is good to also remember, in the hopeful message you send, like, at any day you can make a deal. That's one of the frustrating things I had with I hosted a debate on Israel. It's like, it just felt hopeless. And a lot of people I talk to, it feels hopeless, but like, I have a lot of, I maybe naively see a lot of possibilities of peace there. I see, for example, normalization of relations with Saudi Arabia and Israel, and then Saudi Arabia taking some ownership over Gaza, something like that. Some interesting, where a big major player in that region takes ownership and steps as the middleman.
Yeah, I agree with you, and you're 100% right that, and even before October 7th, I think many steps had been taken away from, the peace process and the feeling of that. I mean, really, I think since the second Intifada is when, like, the appetite for peace, I think, in Israel was greatly diminished. but to your point, I mean, it's going to take really painful concessions on all sides in order to get there. And I think that the personally, I think, and I don't know if I say this for the not necessarily like the Arab world, um, but at least the nation states, like their governments, I think are pretty much there. Like Saudi Arabia and UAE and Jordan and Egypt. Like if the Israelis, they're almost like, look, these are American sock puppets, for the most part, right? And so their thing is that like, okay, 100% of my population is completely opposed to what Israel's doing to Palestine right now. And they just hate that that the nation was created at all, that all the Arabs were kicked out of what is, very important land to them religiously. And so the governments there are like, look, we want to continue to have US tax dollars flooding in here. We'd love to make a deal with Israel, but like you gotta stop doing this to the Palestinians so my own people don't rise up against me. So I think if the Israelis were like, fine, we'll do a two-state solution or something like that, I think Saudi Arabia couldn't wait to broker. In fact, they proposed a two-state solution just a few years ago. I mean, they would love to be a part of that and normalize relations. Amongst the Palestinians, like, which again, I think this had been accepted multiple times, at least by their leadership. It's like, yeah, you're going to have to accept that, like, you lost in 48. You're going to have to accept that you lost in 47. You're going to have to accept that the state of Israel does exist. And you're going to have to accept that, like, the right of return is not going to literally mean that everybody can go back to where they were. And what Israel's going to have to concede is that it was awfully fucked up that they kicked a lot of people out of their land, and that the whole a land for a people without land was never true. That was just a slogan that felt good to avoid what you guys actually did. And the fact that it was inexcusable that you guys occupied these people for 60 years, and that has to end immediately.
I interviewed Douglas Murray recently. He just wrote a book on Israel and Hamas called On Democracies and Death Cults. He makes what I think is a strong pro-Israel case, focusing on Hamas as an evil organization, evil for its corrupt leadership, who's essentially stealing money from the Palestinian people and allocating the money that is there towards terrorist, militaristic operations versus like building up Gaza. Can you steelman the case for and then against this perspective? Sort of centering, we've been talking about the people, about centering around Hamas, which is like this extremist religious organization. The perspective being like they need to be, as you mentioned before, eliminated before any progress can be made.
Okay, so it's Steelman, Douglas Murray's case. I would say, well, I guess the case is right. Look, Hamas is a fanatical death cult, essentially, which I do think is a fair description of them. There is no question that they have pursued a path that was just devastating to their own people. And there's no question they have not spent the resources they have on, their priority has not been uplifting their own people. Their priority has been, I think, essentially antagonizing Israel into this overreaction so that they can turn world opinion against Israel. I think they've been very effective at doing that. And okay, again, I think the argument would come back to something like, and the people kind of voted for this in 2005, and the people we sure do see a lot of people cheering when Hamas is doing some pretty horrific stuff. And so, hey, you got that on one side, and you have a kind of a country that's much more similar to Western societies on the other side.
If we can just like linger on that, Steelman, what do you make of the celebrations in Gaza after October 7th?
I think it's sickening and incredibly disturbing. I guess the way I look at it, I always, and maybe there is a degree of like naivete to this, or perhaps it's just that I just don't want to allow myself to go down a certain path because I think it leads to such dark outcomes. But I just always, I always try to be kind of like against the government, for the people, against the powerful, sympathetic to the powerless. I think that, look, it's sickening. You see big crowds cheering on, people who have been, with these people who have been in captivity for I think some of them for over a year and a half. I also thought when Nikki Haley and other Israeli politicians are signing the bombs before they're launched into Gaza, I found that sickening. I think there's all types. I think like mission accomplished banners and flying on jet. I mean, I think having Bob Hope specials at the end of the Persian Gulf War was sickening. I just think all of it is like horrific. I look at it and I try to say to myself, okay, we had one 9/11 in this country, and we all, like, collectively, we lost our minds as a society. We were ready to go bomb whoever the hell our politicians told us to bomb, and we didn't care how many people it killed, and we killed a lot more than Israel or Hamas has killed doing it. And I try to think to myself, okay, imagine being trapped in what is people can call it whatever they want to. I do think Pat Buchanan and these guys were right to call it a concentration camp. But you're trapped in a 5-mile by 25-mile area where you cannot leave. You are stuck there. You don't have an airport because the Israelis bombed it. You don't have a seaport because they won't allow you. You have no access to trade with the outside world. And you're not suffering through a 9/11. You're suffering through 1,000 9/11s. Your whole life is bad. The people in Gaza their entire life has been being refugees. You know what I mean? Their entire life. There's generations of people have been in this status now. And so, if my society lost its mind after one 9/11, I just have a tough time like judging the people who came up in this environment. But there's no question it is. I mean, it's, profoundly disturbing.
But I wonder how much of the indoctrination is really made the software of their mind permanently anti-peace.
Yeah.
It's like extremify them. And that, it doesn't justify anything, but it's more concerning for the prospects of peace.
Well, I'd say I get your point. It's an interesting question that I don't know if any of us know exactly the answer to, but I would say that, like, even after, what was it, 80 years of the Soviet Union, it's like, and there were real debates back then about like the new communist man and whether the minds had been so warped of people that they would never even care about these things like liberty or national identity or independence. And then yet at the end, it was all still there. It was very repressed and it went underground and people weren't allowed to talk about it, but they all still had it. And in fact, I was just listening the other day to this Murray Rothbard speech from like the early 90s, and he was talking about how there was something where there was like a camera crew interviewed like a Chinese family under real deal Chinese communism. I believe it was before Mao Zedong died, and they were like they were just saying all this crazy shit to the camera. Like they were like, would you rather your sons are like healthy and live good lives, or would you rather they suffer but be loyal obedience to the state? And they were like, we would rather they be obedient to the state, and blah blah blah, and all these things. And Murray Rothbard was saying he saw this interview and he was talking to his friend. He was, oh my God, this is horrible. Like, it's hopeless. These people's minds have been warped. And then he was talking to his friend who's like a China expert who had been there a lot. And he was like, no, they're not. That's what they say when the cameras are around. As soon as the cameras go, like, they're. So anyway, I'm just making the point there that like there is like, look, even in the situation with Israel and Gaza, specifically Gaza, not even the West Bank, when you could look at it, when the peace talks were going on, support for Hamas plummeted. When the peace talks fell apart, support for Hamas went way back up. Every time there's an aggressive military campaign, support for Hamas goes back up. So I just think that, like, I'm more hopeful than not that, like, you could get to a place where, like, but it requires, like, you have to, like, if you do understand the Ron Paul point about blowback, the General McChrystal point about insurgent math, you just realize that it's like you're you're fighting in a way that produces more of the thing that you're fighting. And so the first step is to stop doing that. Like your cure is making the patient more sick. So stop doing that. And then let's see if maybe we could heal.